Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for the third in what is shaping up to be a 32-ish part series here on the channel. Mondays and Wednesdays, if you were catching it in real time, as we go chapter by chapter through Fairy Tale by Stephen King. Look, if you want to make me happy, it really does help me out here on the channel if you decide to hit that like button at some point in time. And first off, if you're not subscribed, subscribe. What do you lose? But also, there is a link to my personal channel to be found in the description below. If you go over there and subscribe as well, that's where I talk about movies and philosophy and just general, more YouTube type stuff, more general interest type stuff, not stuff that you have to be currently reading at the time. But we have here chapter 3, and I want to start by mentioning again some comments from the last video. One in particular from Paul is as such, because I mentioned the Nietzsche reference and some Nazi type goings on. Nazis, the bad guys in World War II. You have to be careful what you say here on YouTube. I'm glad you brought up Nietzsche and the Nazis. The German and war references seemed uncoincidentally strong in this chapter. Okay. A bond is being formed between Reed and Bowditch over two things: a shepherd of German origin with a warmonger name, and because both can quote a German philosopher. That is interesting, and it is, I think, worth noting, because one of the things that I have often said, so I'm not really of the opinion that there is a correct or incorrect reading of any text, because once the author has written it, it doesn't belong to the author anymore. It's gone. It's done. That book at that time belongs to the audience. So I don't know if you can hear all of the sirens going on outside. I live in Kansas City, constant. But because the text no longer belongs to the author, the text now belongs to the audience, that author has no say over correct interpretations. So I don't care what's put into the text. I care what I can draw out of the text, like a salve, right? A strong reading of a text is like a salve, and you rub the ointment on the stinger and you draw out what is there. Whether or not inferences to these things are put in this text by Stephen King, if we can draw them out of it, it's there. And I'm going to be very interested to see what happens. I hadn't even thought, Paul, about the fact that the dog's a German Shepherd. Didn't even occur to me. So it's going to be very interesting to see if anything can be implied, if anything can be drawn out of the text going forward. Varun chimed back in because he's coming to us, he's joining us on this read-along all the way from India. And I had mentioned, one of the things that has made Stephen King such a constant in my readership over the years has been the fact that I recognize all the characters in here. And I wondered if that's still true to someone 3/4 of the way across the globe, right? Is that still the case? Is that why Varun is familiar with Stephen King and Stephen King's writings in 2022, all the way in India? And Varun chimed in, answered, and said, yeah, look, I recognize an alcoholic father raising his son. We have those in India. And of course, right? Of course, I mean, it's obviously, everyone everywhere has these things. But it's one of those things that sort of took me aback, because really, when I had mentioned, recognizing the characters from my own life, What I was really talking about was a lot of the characters strike me in common sense and sensibilities as sort of white trashy, right? I recognize white trash, right? I'm from Kansas City, Missouri. I recognize, I come from that stock. And of course, what I recognize in the character is going to be different from what someone else recognizes in the character and finds interesting. But because the characters are there, people from wherever and from whatever time frame can recognize them. This is why we can pick up books from Ernest Hemingway in the 20s and recognize all of the characters that are written therein. We can pick up books from, I mentioned Sense and Sensibilities. We can pick up books from whenever. This is the best of times, this is the worst of times. I mean, any of the greatest lines of literature that you want to quote still live today because the author is living through those words, and the author is a person who could be here today talking to us. The author still talks to us through time. So yeah, of course. What a boneheaded question from me, and a stunningly precise answer from Varun. So, moving on, we've got the next section of the show is So What Happened. Then we're going to get into the Lit Crit, and then into the writer's notes that I have taken from this, the third chapter of Fairy Tale. So, what happened? Our hero returns to Radar in order that he feed her, and on the way out, he meets a mysterious woman. Is it a witch? Is it a succubus? Is it... No, it's the neighbor. It's the neighbor lady. It's Bowditch's neighbor lady. She is not much of a fan of the old man, and she doesn't really seem to be a fan of much else either. Sort of a negative lady. But she does mention that there was a reporter from the local rag coming around. And she says he was snooping. And then Charlie goes and sees Bowditch in the hospital and agrees to take care of Radar until Bowditch can make his return, can get healthy again. Then Charlie goes back to school and ends up stinking up practice. The coach gets on him, and when the coach is mad at him and tells him to run, Charlie says, stunningly, no. I have a feeling that this was written to be a big standoffish moment. I played a couple different sports in high school. I watched numerous people storm out of practice never to play said sport again. This was very calm. So, he quits baseball, and then he goes to Radar. He goes to feed Radar, he goes to play with Radar, and we get on page 46 and into 47. This little hullabaloo. She followed me outside when I went to collect the fallen ladder. I carried it down to the shed, saw the heavy-duty padlock on the door, and just propped it under the eave. While I was doing it, Radar started to growl. She was crouched down 20 feet in front of the padlocked door, ears back and muzzle wrinkled. What is it, girl? If a skunk or a woodchuck got in there, I can't do much anything about. From behind the door came a scratching, followed by a weird chittering noise that stood up the hair on the back of my neck. Not an animal sound. I'd never heard anything exactly like it. Radar barked, then whined, then backed away with her belly still on the ground. I felt like backing away myself, but instead I whammed on the door with the side of my fist and waited. There was nothing. I could have chalked those sounds up to my imagination if not for Radar's reaction. But there was nothing I could do about it in any case. The door was locked, and there were no windows. Charlie talks to his father about quitting baseball. His father tells him a reporter stopped by. He gives Charlie the reporter's number. It turns out the reporter is doing the human interest type article on Charlie, as Charlie has saved a man's life. Or he hopes to do that story anyway, and he hopes to get a picture of Charlie and Radar, but Charlie says that he has to ask Mr. Bowditch's permission to get a picture with Radar, and he agrees that he will indeed ask Mr. Bowditch if he can have said picture. That's where we are in the story. What do we think of Charlie so far? First off, Charlie is not a child of the new millennium. He uses too many unbelievable phrases, and I'll get to that in the writer's portion of this video, the writer's notes portion of this video. But Charlie is being set up as your standard hero, the all-American boy. He's good at football and baseball, the American pastimes, old and new. He does not hesitate to do things. He simply alpha males his way through them, right? He makes a decision and goes. He's very forthright with things. He takes on responsibility. And we saw a little bit that he's really starting to end up assuming the role of an older person, taking note of all of these things that are wrong with Mr. Bowditch's house and how he thinks he could fix them. That's a weird sort of semi-Oedipal sort of dynamic there between Bowditch in his absence and Charlie. What do we think of this? What do we think of Charlie assuming the role of hero? Literally, by saving a man's life, and then sort of tertiarily by making decision after decision, and even when faced with mysterious danger, whatever is in the shed, instead of saying, "Oh my goodness, what was that?" he knocks on the door to prompt whatever it is into making more noise so he can sort of try to discern what it is that's back there. But moving on from that, we have some small moments that bring attention to things which might be going on deeper in the story. When he shows up at the hospital, the nurse tells him, "Hey, man, he's had a number done. He's had one surgery. He's going to have another. He's going to have a fake hip put in." Okay, great. We know that about older folks. We know that about Mr. Bowditch at this point. Sometimes the hips go, right? On the kissing page to this, I believe that happened on page 40, but I couldn't find it in a cursory glance. But on the kissing page to that, page 41, we get this from Mr. Bowditch as he is thinking about how long he's going to be in the hospital, and the fact that he's not going to be able to take care of Radar all that time. He says, "I guess I need to think about putting her down. She's had a good life, but now her hips are going to say that her hips are gone." The same way that the nurse had let us know that Mr. Bowditch's hips need replacing. The one thing I will sort of concede here is this seems to negate my previous figurings that perhaps Radar is a sort of transmuted person into a dog, right? I don't think that is the case now if he is so quick to say, "Well, maybe I ought to put old girl down." Because you don't sit around and say, "Well, I think it's time to put my wife down. I think it's time to have my mother executed." None of those things. Well, maybe they cross your mind. But probably you wouldn't say them out loud. And I think that really puts to rest the idea that maybe Radar is a transmuted sort of person into a dog that will be changed back into a person in a fairy tale type way. But right after the part of the chapter, or the chapter where Mr. Bowditch tears up for this dog, when Mr. Bowditch doesn't seem to tear up for very much, saying maybe it's time to put her down, that's a pretty quick turn, I think. But luckily for Radar, at least, our hero-to-be decides that he'll take care of her until it's time for Mr. Bowditch to return to the old stead. But we do see that there are parallels beyond simply their relationship with Radar and Bowditch. That is something that is very small in the text, but it is something that lets us know. Over on 43, I turned to go. This is when Charlie is at the hospital and it's about time to leave. I turned to go and then he spoke again. But I don't think it was to me. A brave man helps. A coward just gives presents. He fell silent and then began to snore. So first off, the obvious question is, if it was not meant to Charlie, to whom was Mr. Bowditch speaking? We've got several references to God already, so perhaps this is Mr. Bowditch in a drug-induced sort of, I won't say mirage, depending on how you feel about religions, but certainly a drug-induced sort of haze, speaking directly to his God about Charlie. A brave man helps. A coward just gives presents. Now, the one thing that I wonder with the sort of tenacity of this statement is whether, look, Bowditch is sort of a nasty old man, right? He's sort of spiteful. A lot of times, what happens is someone grows spiteful when they have regrets about life. Stephen King is obviously good enough a writer to understand that if you're dealing with a spiteful old man, that spite doesn't come from nowhere. He wasn't born a spiteful old man. He was born a young man. He was born a child, grew to a young man, and the things that happened to him along the way shaped him into who he is. So, if he is a spiteful old man, maybe we're going to get a scene of Bowditch being the present-giving coward. Is that how he knows this adage? It is also reminiscent of, where are we at here? It is reminiscent of a quote from Euripides. A coward turns away, but a brave man's choice is danger. So that's not exactly the same quote, but it's kind of close, isn't it? A brave man helps. A brave man's choice is danger. The danger of assuming the responsibility in any given situation. Euripides says a coward turns away. Bowditch tells us that a coward simply gives presents. Gives something, and ironically, with the word choice, if you're talking about homophones, the present is given to make up for lack of presence. You give a present if you're not going to if you're going to be absent. You give a present due to lack of presence. Presence. So I think that there is something to be made of that. Now, Euripides was a Greek tragedian. So are we dealing with tragedy in the case of Bowditch that will be so there's a couple different ways to have relationships in text. Some relationships rhyme. Some relationships, like with Radar and Bowditch, they're both old, they're both losing, their hips are giving out. They're both underweight. They're both sort of sad, in sad condition, I'll say. But others complement. They don't rhyme, but they complement. They are sort of set up as opposites. If Bowditch is living in a tragedy, are we getting from Charlie a comedy? And where will we notice those beats in the story? If it is a comedy, that's a coming. The quitting baseball beat. Was that a strange beat? I said that it was sort of melodramatic. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad beat. However, it feels a little bit, from a reader's perspective, I think, as, hey, I needed something to change this chapter. Maybe Charlie quits baseball. We've already used it in a lazy manner. We have to admit that the setup for Charlie being the All-American boy was given to us in lazy fashion. It's not given to us in scene. It's given to us in reference. Now, this is a point that could very easily fall into the sort of writer's notes section of this video, but I think it's worth mentioning now because I think it's more impactful. I think it's more impactfully bad as a reader, right, than as someone taking notes as a writer, because it's possible to pull it off. It's possible to tell, not show, but why would you? And from the reader's perspective, it is the reader who really suffers from being told, not shown. There are so many experiences ripped from the reader when the reader is told as opposed to shown. And if we're quitting baseball this early in the story, how necessary was it? This scene, so a lot, through three chapters, this novel feels very, and I hate to use this term in this fashion, it feels very genre. It feels set up, character moment, tag. Set up, character moment, tag. We have this setup in this chapter of building suspense with meeting the mysterious neighbor, with getting the mysterious quote from Bowditch. Then we've got the delivery of quitting baseball, and then the tag of what's in the sort of shed. It feels belabored. It feels very... If genre were to be a dirty word, it is for the monotony of this type of presentation. Kind of like that. If genre is to be a dirty word, it is for the monotony of this type of presentation. This isn't genuine storytelling. Stephen King is such a talented storyteller. This sort of setup moment tag that's going on here feels dirty genre. And I don't think genre is something that has to be dirty. is something that has to be seen as less talented, right? But here, I don't think Stephen King is pulling it off. I don't think Stephen King's getting away with it. The baseball beat, the quitting baseball scene, is itself lazy. Stephen King is such a talented writer that he's able to give us images, that he's able to give us little morsels in that scene that stick with us. He's able to make us see that scene. But did you feel it? Did you feel the visceral anger that it would take for someone who's about to be, was it all state in baseball, to give it up? In that moment, I didn't. I wasn't there for that. It didn't, it's, in fact, it even sort of pulled me out that it was so, right there, pop, pop, pop. I quit baseball. Oh, okay. The last thing I have in the lit crit portion of this video, the rag, for whom this, no one calls it a rag anymore. Stephen King, drop it. What are you doing? Anyway, the rag. This reporter works for the rag. The rag is called the Weekly Sun. The Weekly Sun can be read as 6 Days of Darkness. The sun is weekly. The sun appears weekly. The Weekly Sun, the light that happens once a week. There are 6 days of darkness. That is a little bit more of a horror story joke than it is a fairy tale type joke, if it is in fact meant as a joke. I'm not sure, but it is, I like it. The Weekly Sun. 6 Days of Darkness, right? Writer's notes from this episode on page 40. And this is, well, I'll just read it first. On page 40, the last paragraph before we get to part 3 of this chapter, if you want to see him, this is the nurse talking to Charlie once he gets to the hospital. If you want to see him, you'd better go on down. I just gave him a shot for pain, and it will probably put him under before long. Broken leg and hip aside, he's severely underweight. Did you see Bowditch is underweight? I didn't. Now, it's possible that that was mentioned at some point in time and I just didn't connect it. But here's the thing. I think, for me as a writer, the appearance of the characters isn't all that important to me. But if for you as a writer, it is important, mightn't it be important to get that information out there before page 40 in the novel? That this guy is severely underweight? How did you see Bowditch as he was presented? I didn't see him as underweight. The next thing I want to talk about happens on 42. And this is if we're using genre in genre fiction as a dirty word. Here's why. We get this statement. His eyes were getting glassy. His voice a little, let me start over. His eyes were getting glassy, his voice a little slurry. Whatever the nurse had given him was starting to work. On the nose. We don't need that last sentence. We don't need it. Trust your reader. This is the type of thing that Hemingway does away with. Hemingway just gets rid of all of that. In fact, Hemingway probably gets rid of his eyes were getting glassy, his voice a little slurry, and puts in a little bit of dialogue that is slurred. That's probably all Hemingway gives you. Part of the dirty word association with genre fiction is that oftentimes what makes something feel dirty, genre, is that the author isn't trusting you. The author is spoon-feeding you everything. The author is giving you everything that the author wants you to know or feel or think. And that sort of compounds in a second reading. One of the beautiful things about literary, because I'm not going to downplay genre fiction. In fact, what I always say is you can be an absolute turd and pick up Shakespeare and see the literature therein. But if you're real intelligent, you can take a Garfield strip comic and show the literature therein. The literature is there. How much do you bring to the table in order to coax it out? The literature is there, regardless of the piece. So, there's literature everywhere. One of the things about literature with the capital L is that literature with the capital L changes as you, the reader, change. How? How does it do that? Literature with the capital L, the Shakespeare literature, the Hemingway literature, the Emily Dickinson literature, leaves out a whole lot. And that whole lot is put in by the reader. Genre fiction, as the dirty word, gives you all of that stuff. So Stephen King here shows us, I'll say shows, the eyes getting glassy. It sort of tells us that the voice was slurred because he doesn't put it in his dialogue. But then he just outright tells us whatever the nurse had given him was kicking in, was starting to work. Yeah, Steve, we got it. You showed us his eyes. You told us about his speech. We know that the nurse gave him something because it happened a whole 300 words before. We're there. We get it. We're on board. Leave that last sentence out. The last note that I have: do you believe Charlie? Is Charlie believable as a teenager? Is his voice believable? We're getting this first-person narrative. He uses phrases like white on rice. I'm sort of a corny guy. I've never even used that. He uses the word geez. I'm sort of a corny guy. I've never used that. He used the phrase later, Gator. Charlie a real guy? I think this is worth examining. Is Charlie, as a character, believable? Do we believe 94-year-old Stephen King writing as a teenager in the 2000s? Or is this the time frame here gives me fits. This might be today. I can't remember. I can't remember exactly when it's happening, right? Was he born in 95? Was he born in 2000? I can't remember. Anyway, that's all that I have for this episode, the third in a 32-ish part series. If you want to help me out here on the channel, it really does help me out if you decide to hit that like button. Maybe share the video with someone who enjoys Stephen King or reading in general. Maybe not this video if they enjoy Stephen King, because it sounds like I've been ragging on him quite a bit. But make sure you're subscribed if you were here for the third in a 32-part series. And remember that Friday, I will have a writer's quote video that will go in the writer's quote playlist here on the channel. But Monday, we'll be back with Chapter 4, and Wednesday with Chapter 5. And I hope to have you back for all of those videos.